Greetings, everyone, and welcome to the National Physical Activity Society's webinar entitled The U.S. National Physical Activity Plan, Strategies to Achieve Health Equity. I'm having a little bit of technical difficulty today with the recording, and I am not positive that it's actually recording properly, but I'm going to proceed as if it is and introduce you to today's speaker. First, just a couple of things. The monthly webinar series features topics for physical activity practitioners across a variety of settings, and you can find recordings of our webinars, including this one, I hope, later this week at our website, which is physicalactivitysociety.org. You can also join our mailing list there. Throughout the presentation today, you can submit questions via the chat box in the questions pane on the control panel. Send them anytime, and we will answer them during the Q&A portion of our webinar. Today's speaker, Dr. NiCole Keith, is a research scientist at Indiana University Center for Aging Research. She's also a professor at Indiana University in the Department of Kinesiology, and she's recently been appointed acting associate dean at IU. She serves as the National Physical Activity Plan, or served on the Revision Executive Committee, and leads the National Physical Activity Plan Diversity Work Group. Just a side note that National Physical Activity Society has a board seat on the National Physical Activity Plan Alliance, so we are partners in this effort. We are not the original sponsors or distributors of the National Physical Activity Plan, and because our names are similar, we sometimes get confused that way. But Dr. Keith continues researching methods through which physical activity can positively influence the health outcomes of socioeconomically challenged community residents, and I'd like to welcome Dr. Keith to our webinar today. NiCole, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thanks, Pam. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, go ahead.
Okay, all right, great. So a brief presentation overview. I'm going to just briefly review the U.S. National Physical Activity Plan as well as the purpose of the revision. Then I will do a brief introduction of who participated in the diversity work group and present to you our definition of inclusion. And then I will address the importance of diversity among groups and explore potential root causes of disparities. And I'll spend about 10 minutes going through U.S. history, different points where I think that it potentially affected disparate groups and participation by these groups. And then I'll present the disparities in physical activity among various groups. I'll offer some specific strategies and tactics that were presented by our work group, and then recommendations that I'll give to you for implementing the National Physical Activity Plan in your community or among your organizations. So first, just briefly, the first National Physical Activity Plan for the United States was launched in May of 2010. And since the launch, efforts to implement, build recognition, and expand the network of the plan have continued. The plan was updated and revised in 2015 because the National Physical Activity Plan Alliance that Pam spoke of was committed to ensuring that it reflected the current state of science and practice. So the sectors were identified as being most influential to physical activity included community recreation, fitness and parks, business and industry, education, faith-based settings, healthcare, mass media, public health, sport, and transportation, land use, and community design. The sector subcommittees identified strategies and tactics to not only promote physical activity, but also to make the active choice the easy choice for Americans. During the revision, it was also critically important that recommendations made in the plan address the needs of all Americans. And for this reason, after the work of the other sector subcommittees had been completed, there was a diversity subcommittee that was organized and charged with offering valuable feedback to the National Plan's Coordinating Committee regarding issues related to diversity. So the Alliance identified individuals with expertise in physical activity, equity, and inclusion in a variety of areas, And our first goal was to identify what and who we were thinking about when discussing groups or populations who were least likely to be physically active. So I was the chair, as Pam described earlier, of the diversity subcommittee. We had Diane Carroll from the CDC, Naila Coleman from Children's National Health System, Carlos Crespo from Portland State University, Bess Marcus from UC San Diego, Justin Moore from Wake Forest, Jim Rimmer from University of Alabama, Birmingham, and Renee Umstadt from Baylor University. So within the National Physical Activity Plan, we wrote an inclusion statement that identified populations that are least likely to be physically active, and we attempted to explain in as few words as possible why diversity is important. And believe it or not, this is the abbreviated version of our inclusion statement, which says, in order to increase physical activity in all segments of the U.S. population, the Alliance recognizes that the plan must address the substantial disparities in physical activity that exist across groups based on gender, age, race, ethnicity, socioeconomic status, physical, cognitive, or sensory ability, and geography. Further, the Alliance recognizes that the remarkable diversity of the American population and has been committed to producing a plan that will encourage persons of all religious, cultural, ideological, sexual orientation, and gender identity groups to become more physically active. So why is diversity important? So most people are most comfortable where there's trust and social cohesion that's found in homogeneous groups. For this reason, people tend to seek out others who think, look, and behave in ways that are similar to them. Oftentimes, these groups have similar personal histories, experiences, and access to similar resources. Some very well-meaning people get quite uncomfortable with diversity-related discussions for a variety of reasons. Maybe I'll say something that will be offensive or be politically incorrect. I might feel being more inclusive means that I have to give something up and there'll be less for me. So the constructs of trust and social cohesion tend to go down in diverse groups. However, diverse groups perform better. This is true both intellectually and economically. The most successful societies, systems, and organizations intentionally build diversity in order to address equity. So when convincing a group that equity, diversity, and inclusion are important, it may be good to focus on fairness. Most people are interested in equality and fairness to the members, constituents, and communities that are being served. Equality is about sameness. It promotes fairness and justice by giving everyone the same thing. That can only work if everyone starts in the same place. Equity is about fairness. It's about making sure people get access to the same opportunities. And sometimes our differences in race or disability or geographic location or religion or sexual orientation or identity, veteran status, gender, physical capability, or some other variance can create barriers to access and participation. So we must first ensure equity before we can enjoy equality. When considering why some U.S. groups find physical activity challenging, it's helpful to take a look at points in American history where the same kinds of groups found access to basic rights and the movements that occurred and laws that were passed to improve human condition. So I'm going to go way back and start with the American slave trade, which began in the 1600s. And for 5 generations, this practice continued through the 1800s. That was about 60 years after international slave trade ended. Slavery in the United States was then abolished. Whether they're descendants of slaves, like me, or descendants of slave owners, some people have a difficult time thinking about or talking about the inhumane practice of slavery. But we have to talk about it. Much of our country was built by slaves, and many of the inequities that exist today are a residual result of slavery. So by the 1830s, slavery continued in the southern states and existed on plantations and small farms in big cities and towns and throughout several industries, including transportation. Keep in mind that slaves were property. Most white Southerners didn't own slaves because they couldn't afford them. I recently visited Richmond, Virginia, and I was surprised to learn that a strong, healthy black male of prime age cost about $34,000 in today's currency. So only about 25% of Southern whites owned slaves. However, it was estimated that 100% of Southern whites supported slavery, which ensured a class of people that was lower than the poorest white American farmer. The Civil War began in 1861, and the northern states opposed the expansion of slavery, and President Lincoln issued the original Emancipation Proclamation. The Civil War marks the first time that African Americans were afforded liberties, such as the right to marry or to leave institutions. The abolition of slavery was the primary goal of the war. Reconstruction, or the restoration of the country, was part of a highly contentious post-war effort, and although Congress assisted former slaves in their transition to freedom, several southern states enacted black codes to curb their rights. The federal government eventually overturned these codes, but several decades later, many of these same states passed Jim Crow laws, which set the tone for black-white relations for decades to come. The progressives worked to make American society a better and safer place. They wanted big business to be more responsible and worked to clean up corrupt city governments, to improve living and working conditions for the large number of recent immigrants, and many progressives were also concerned with the environment and conservation of resources. This generation of Americans also hoped to make the world a more democratic place by expanding the right to vote to women. The progressive era led to the formation of black churches, and faith-based organizations continue to be influential in American society and are a current focus of the National Physical Activity Plan. The Niagara Movement attempted to bring about legal change, addressing issues of crime, economics, religion, health, and education by demanding equal economic and educational opportunities and the right to vote for black men and women. This movement was the precursor for the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, or the NAACP. So during World War I, white soldiers refused to fight along the side of black soldiers, so the black soldiers who were eager to support war efforts fought with France and other European countries. Between wars, returning black veterans were abused and lynched for demanding to be treated like white veterans. During this time, most blacks moved north and west to expanding industries, and the treatment of returning blacks and the impact of the Great Migration would influence U.S. race relations for generations to come. So hopefully by now you understand my point. As painful as it is to think about, much of America was established under inequitable conditions that fueled our country's success. Historically, the U.S. thrived on the homogeneity in leadership and disparate conditions of those without power. Folks, this is painful stuff because people bled and died for equity. Look at the timeline. Many of us were born, or at least part of the first or second generation of people who benefited from the end of segregation, the right to vote, or the right to live in communities regardless of race, gender, or disability. When we talk about root causes, the roots run deep. U.S. inequity started in the 1600s and continued through the 1900s. What we're working through isn't ancient history, it's recent history. And as we approach this problem, we must consider how our history impacts conditions today. So now let's take a look at the disparities that the National Physical Activity Plan must address. As you can see, very few adults meet the U.S. Physical Activity Guidelines, and Americans who are Black and Latino are more likely to be classified as being inactive when compared to whites. U.S. children and youth present both gender and racial disparities in inactivity. Black and Latina girls are more likely to be inactive when compared to white girls. Black and Latino boys are more likely to be inactive when compared to white boys, and in general, girls are more likely to be inactive when compared to boys. The gender disparity in physical activity persists throughout adulthood, where 23% of men meet the U.S. physical activity guidelines when compared to 18% of women. Men spend 18 more weekday minutes and 13 more weekend minutes in moderate to vigorous physical activity when compared to women, and 10% of men when compared to 18% of women report being inactive. As children and youth age, their physical activity participation also tends to decline. While 77% of kids between 9 and 13 years old report participating in physical activity in the last 7 days, that number declines for high school students. This occurs for a variety of reasons related to the time and access to opportunities for physical activity. Over half of people with disabilities get no aerobic physical activity. It is well documented that cardiovascular exercise is associated with positive health outcomes, so promotion of physical activity for people with disabilities is imperative. This is because adults with disabilities are 3 times more likely to have chronic disease than those without disabilities. There is emerging research on physical activity in sexual minorities that indicate disparities in physical activity for many members of these populations. It's estimated that between 57 and 78% of lesbians do not engage in sufficient amounts of physical activity. A study of 12,779 boys and girls who self-identified as being a sexual minority reported participating in moderate to vigorous physical activity 1.2 to 2.6 hours a week less than boys and girls who did not self-identify as being a sexual minority. More research about physical activity participation among these groups is needed. You may be familiar with the social determinants of health, which explain that psychosocial, cognitive, and emotional factors are associated with health outcomes. The same is true for physical activity participation, where greater participation is associated with greater health knowledge, better problem-solving skills to make more informed choices, more social support, better social norms, and greater potential for schedule flexibility. The structural factors that promote or restrict physical activity include the quality of housing in one's community, access to transportation where reliable public transit that's easy to get to is associated with more physical activity participation, and lastly, having access to quality recreational facilities within a community is associated with greater physical activity participation. So whether the outcome was slavery or war or migration or civil rights, the driver was one or more components of the triple bottom line in the United States. So when approaching the U.S. Physical Activity Plan, diversity, equity, and inclusion were considered from economic, environmental, and social perspectives. Social equity considers what individuals need in order to thrive. When considering ways to get disparate populations more active, we have to intervene within this frame. How can physical activity support access to resources, assist with meeting basic needs, address the maintenance of health and well-being, promote economic opportunities, and help those who may have been historically disenfranchised have a public voice? When we promote physical activity within this context, we may be able to make active opportunities more relevant and valuable to these populations. There are other key questions that need to be addressed across all of the sectors of the National Physical Activity Plan. What are the most important ways physical activity influences equity? What are the opportunities to address equity while increasing physical activity opportunities? And how can goals and metrics be developed to make equity relevant and achievable to its implementers? When addressing physical activity in low-income communities, we must be attentive to smart growth. After all, if community development doesn't benefit existing residents, is the growth truly smart? It's important that plans are in place to retain existing community residents and businesses. And during construction, it's important to avoid exposing people to unhealthy conditions, such as the pollutants that result from demolition or closing sidewalks or bike lanes, putting active commuters at risk. There are several stakeholders who should be engaged when implementing the National Physical Activity Plan in an equitable manner. These include people who are directly involved in community redesign, such as residents, city planners, and engineers. People and businesses that exist in communities adjacent to the one being redesigned can also be impacted, and they should be invited to the conversation as well. Lastly, and again, people and businesses being impacted by the production or destruction of resources must be engaged in the process. So again, to avoid gentrification that sometimes accompanies growth toward a healthier community, we must make sure the physically active environment is accessible, affordable, and engaging. We have to demonstrate how it positively influences the health and well-being of residents and other users, as well as members of the surrounding communities. And we must demonstrate how creating a more physically active community can positively influence the economy. Some specific suggestions in working toward these goals include facilitating meaningful community engagement in planning and land use decisions, promoting clean, safe environments, strengthening existing communities, providing public and private as well as active transportation options, improving access to opportunities and health-promoting resources, and preserving and building on distinctive community features that are most valued by residents. Other strategies that we identified included advocating for those who have limited public voice, building inclusive structures that support engagement and decision-making of community members, promoting equity through dialogue that reflects a range of social identities, generating ideas that build capacity, and enhancing community and quality of life. The National Physical Activity Plan Revision Executive Committee recommended that all strategies and tactics be informed by research-based interventions that are published in scientific journals. Evidence-based data demonstrates the need for physical activity interventions, offers starting points to establish goals and objectives that would reduce physical inactivity, and offer models for success. At this point, you may be thinking that this is a great strategy if you have the resources for implementation, but frequently this is not the case. I agree with that statement, and while we may be somewhat or completely critical of this process, I'm personally happy that we're even attempting to address health promotion and disease prevention rather than only focusing on treatment. So additionally, as a physical activity researcher, I'm also thrilled that physical inactivity is a target. However, stay with me because I'm going to address our frustrations soon. So lastly, we recommended that once national physical activity plans and national physical activity guidelines are established, continued evaluation of physical activity interventions, and especially those that include diverse populations, are recommended. Additionally, accurate measures of surveillance should be identified and used across all populations. In reality, even nations, cities, and communities that have had public and/or private support to develop physical activity plans and guidelines, we've found implementation difficult. Most surveillance is reliant on self-report data, which tend to be inaccurate because people are unclear about what physical activity is and/or they misremember whether they were active, at what level, and for how long. Culturally, physical activity participation may be impeded by norms and values, and it's not reasonable to expect that every recommendation will be acceptable or even possible across varied groups. I'm confident that you can think of several other barriers to implementation that exceed the scope of my presentation, but understanding these and other difficulties to successfully addressing physical inactivity at the population level is a step toward progress. So while government and private policies are helpful, implementation of physical activity strategies have been slow. Political science models may help identify barriers and facilitators to increasing the demand for inclusive public physical activity policies and moving physical activity into population health. Potential models include the multiple streams framework, the advocacy coalition framework, and the punctuated equilibrium theory. So the multiple streams framework suggests that the greatest opportunities for change occur when the streams of problem, policy, and politics are addressed. The problem recognizes that there's a need to focus on an issue through strategic actions. Solutions are presented in the form of policies. The politics describe the political climate, the arrangement of constituents, and the national mood for policy implementation. The greatest opportunities for implementation occur when there is public attention and public support. The challenge for physical activity leaders is to keep physical activity in the public forefront. An example of how this can be accomplished is the combined efforts of the Pan American Health and World Health Organizations to deliver an active living contest among North and South American cities. Here, an evaluation of policies that support physical activity not only determined the winners, but also brought attention to these important policies and their value to community health. Cities were awarded for policies that were supportive of preserving natural environments through recycling, water recovery, and bicycle and pedestrian-friendly environments. These cities were also commended for additionally offering diverse programs that support sport and physical activity. The Advocacy Coalition framework aligns groups with the same core beliefs. These groups coordinate and leverage their power. Included is a focus on educating individuals who are able to make changes. Resources that may not be available to all are shared across sectors. When necessary, there are strategies to align policies with politics. The International Bike Fund is an example of an advocacy coalition framework. Groups representing urban planning, economic development, education, and tourism combine their resources to promote a healthier planet. Lastly, the punctuated equilibrium theory recognizes that policy tends to remain the same unless change is warranted. This theory also acknowledges that policy can change quickly under certain circumstances, such as new science, different perceptions, increased media attention, and public interest, crisis, or social influence. In the United States, the President's Council on Physical Fitness was established in 1957 and grew out of a scientific paper published in 1953 that showed 4,400 students in U.S. public schools were less physically fit in comparison to same-age students in Switzerland, Italy, and Austria. This presented a threat to national security, and that notion was embraced by both the media and the general public. So on June 23, 2010, over 50 years after the Council's establishment, the White House announced a new executive order from President Obama changing the Council's name to the President's Council on Fitness, Sports, Nutrition, and expands the mission of the Council to include nutrition. This is a fantastic example of keeping an age-old physical activity and obesity problem in the public forefront. U.S. physical activity researchers are thrilled with this council and enjoy the campaigns that come from the council. This office focuses on youth. I wonder what we could do to get this done for adults. So I'm going to end where I started, that these sectors that are most influential to physical activity have identified strategies and tactics to increase physical activity in all Americans. The work of our diversity subcommittee was completed as we thought about both physical and contextual challenges in physical activity participation among those least likely to participate. Cross-sectoral contributions recognize worldwide physical inactivity must be addressed by more than the traditional groups, such as educators, healthcare providers, public health professionals, and scientists focused on building the evidence, but must also include faith-based or social services organizations, government officials, policymakers, community planners, and any group that can influence physical activity participation. I want to thank you for participating in this webinar. I want to thank the National Physical Activity Society and Pam Eidson for inviting me to speak on this topic that I think is so important, and I welcome any questions that you may have.
Thank you, NiCole. And you know, you reminded me I forgot to introduce myself at the beginning. I was having such difficulties with the technical parts of it that I didn't tell everybody that I'm Pam Eidson and I'm Executive Director of the National Physical Activity Society. We are ready for questions. I have a couple of them so far, and welcome any other questions you want to type into the panel there. The first thing I wanted to pick up on was when you talked about having, and this is really a complicated question, so feel free to take whatever slice of it you would like, but when you talked about having those important conversations, the ones that are difficult to have about disparities, about the history of slavery in our country, and about the resulting and residual effects over the generations. And I'm wondering if you have any guidance based on the research you've done or just in sort of thinking about this issue on how to help facilitate those kinds of conversations.
Sure, so that is a tough question. I think that the most important part of it is to be honest with your knowledge. So learn as much as you can, read as much as you can, but then understand from community to community those residual effects that you describe are different. And so even if it's the same population of people, their experiences might be very different. So one size doesn't fit all. You have to learn about the community, and the only way to do that is to ask questions. To be really comfortable with saying, I'm asking these questions because I want to understand the challenges that you're facing from your perspective, and then be completely comfortable and open and honest in the dialogue that ensues.
Okay, thanks. And now, in just thinking specifically about the National Physical Activity Plan and the societal sectors, and I believe you mentioned this in looking at it from a diversity work group point of view, but within each of those sectors, are there places that you would point to as specifically addressing disparities issues or inclusion issues, or do you think that they're woven throughout each of the strategies in such a way that you really have to take a look at the plan as a whole?
So that's a good question, Pam. So what I'm thinking about is that all of these sectors within our society intersect. So the way that they were separated out was just based on people's knowledge or their experiences or their level of expertise. And then the diversity work group was charged with interweaving equity and inclusion language throughout the plan. It was easier to do in some places than others. And when you think about the different groups within our diversity work group that we were trying to target, it also became challenging. Where we had the most difficulty potentially was in business and industry, because the business and industry goal is to turn a profit. And so being inclusive and being mindful that that's the goal simultaneously, we really focused on business and industry to try to make that language more inclusive while still understanding that people have to have certain amounts of knowledge and skills to do a job. And so you can only be so inclusive. So that was a place where it was harder. Some place where it was easier or seemed more natural was really with transportation, land use, and community design, because of the built environment and different aspects of physical activity that could be infused within a community that really wouldn't cost the city any more money or cost the community any more money. Something that's different is that originally sport was included in community recreation, fitness, and parks. It got pulled out at the end of all of our work. We looked at sport and said this is a different entity than those other groups, and there's opportunities for sports to address diversity, equity, and inclusion in its own way different than community recreation, fitness, and parks. So that's a long answer. We infuse diversity throughout all of the language. We try to make the language more inclusive throughout all of the sectors. And there isn't really one place that if we worked on this sector really hard, it would address health equity.
Okay. One thing that this is reminding me of, and I know I spoke with you about this at the Active Living Research Conference when we talked in February, is that the membership of the National Physical Activity Society has a survey that goes out every other year on the characteristics and desires and training needs and all sorts of things about the people who make up the society. And one thing that I pulled out from the data that we got in the 2016 survey, so it was just over a year ago, was that over 90% of the respondents were white. And in my experience, that's not mapping to what public health in general, the population of public health is like. And so it's surprising to me that we get a population that responds to the survey that's over 90% white, and I don't know how to validate whether that's true as far as our membership goes or not. But I think in general it might point to a need to have more people of color working in the physical activity public health approaches field. And I don't have easy solutions for this, but I'm just wondering if you have any thoughts about that.
Yeah, so there are a couple of groups that are working on this problem. But what I will say that I just recently learned about after we talked is there's something that's called the National Minority Research Mentoring Network. I think that's the right name. But it matches underrepresented minorities who are interested in studying topics, scientific topics in physical activity and health are certainly those, with mentors to help them get through the challenges that are faced by university students. So part of this is if we're going to have physical activity professionals who are representing diverse groups, we have to have a diverse student body. We have to have diverse trainees. And so really getting into that population of students who are deciding what they want their major to be would be a good place to start. And then mentoring those students throughout so that they continue to remain in our field would be helpful. Go ahead, I'm sorry.
No, actually, I was just going to underscore what you were saying, but also mention another disparate population because that question that I asked was focusing primarily on racial differences. But you already mentioned earlier that on the health equity work group, diversity work group for the National Physical Activity Plan is Jim Rimmer from Alabama, and I know that we have a couple of people from that shop on the call today, so I wanted to give a shout out to the folks over at NICPAD, the National, oh boy, I'm going to have to say it right, National Center or National Coalition for Health, Physical Activity, and Disabilities, NICPAD.org. They have tons of information on working with people with disabilities in physical activity world. So I wanted to give a shout out to them and say hi to the folks that we know who are on the call from there today.
And you know, Pam, that's a really great example because Jim from the Lakeshore Foundation was really when you talk about having difficult conversations, was really great that when we first wrote the inclusion statement, we said people of varied abilities, and he said, no, you have to use the word disability. And it was like such an eye-opener for people who are uncomfortable with thinking about or interacting with people with disabilities to use the word and make it part of our normal thread of language. Kind of normalizes this population for us.
So in other words, by being nervous about using the language, which is, understandable, people are then, I guess, becoming so afraid of using certain language that they then leave out populations. Is that what we're saying?
Yes.
Yeah.
And
Allison.
unintentionally so.
Hi, Allison. I see your comment for the thanks for the shout out. That's Allison Tubbs from NICPAD. I know there's a couple of others of you on the line too. So I really do like to refer people to that website, and I will add it to the post-webinar resources on our website on the entry that has this webinar. And along with that, I wanted to go back to one of the things.
Uh-oh.
Hello?
Yes.
Hi. Yes, I'm so sorry. There seems to have been a cutoff on our audio. I hope that we're back online now.
Okay.
NiCole, I'm going to pick up right where I left off. I was asking about a report that you showed a slide of that was called G is for Gentrification, and I'm wondering who published that.
I do not know.
Okay, I'm gonna have to look for it. Yeah, I'm gonna have to search for it and look for it because I want to see that too. And I know there's been a fair amount of discussion recently, and also some resources from some of our partner organizations about that topic. In particular, I'm thinking of the Safe Routes to School National Partnership and America Walks as two that have done some recent work on that area.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a concern because, for example, in our community, on the near east side of Indianapolis, so just east of downtown, they have intentionally done a community redesign with the avoidance of gentrification. And a really good example is at certain blocks, if you purchase a house, the foundation of the house has to remain the same, so you can't destroy the house and rebuild a bigger, better house. Several blocks were purchased by the social services organization within the community, so the houses on those blocks are protected as well, so that community members can remain in the community while the community design improves. And it seems to have worked relatively well. I did hear one story from a friend, a young man who's a senior in high school, who said that his parents were going to sell their house because somebody is buying up the houses on their street and moving their family members in, and they're offering $250,000 for a house that they bought for $40,000 40 years ago. Mm-hmm. So it's really hard to tell people don't sell your house when you're being offered that kind of markup.
Right, and having no, say, not just price controls, but even the square footage or the footprint controls are one way to address that, but I don't think it's the only way. And we've certainly got some issues along those same lines here in Metro Atlanta. I wanted to ask you something that, I'm sorry, I just wanted to ask you something that was about cultural differences in physical activity as far as the way that different cultures view physical activity. And I'm wondering if you have any comments on that as far as any research goes on whether people in different cultural groups view physical activity more favorably or more unfavorably.
Oh, that's a great question, and I think that it can't just be broadly addressed across cultural groups. So, for example, Latino population in the Midwest might be different than on the West Coast or in the South. And so there's research that indicates that was performed on Latinos in the Midwest that physical activity participation has to include family time, needs to be done with support of the man of the house. David Marquez and his group described this as machismo, and so I was presenting some of his work and to some people in Florida, and they were like, that doesn't exist here. so I think it depends on the group, but it also depends, and remember I said in my earlier comments that the same group could have a very different lived experience, and so their response to physical activity participation might be very different. There are other examples with age differences, and so older women tend to be uncomfortable putting their bodies in positions that are required with some parts of exercise, some forms of exercise in front of older men. And so it just depends, but then you will find older adults who have no problem because they were raised exercising.
Excellent. Okay, so not necessarily that we can say with any kind of broad strokes lessons learned about particular cultural groups, and even if we did try to say that, we'd certainly find exceptions, is what I'm hearing you say.
Yes.
One other point that I wanted to pick up on, and by the way, audience, again, please feel free to put in questions in the chat box or the questions box, and we'll try to get to your questions. But to pick up on your point about fairness near the beginning, and I've been looking at a lot of long-form journalism articles on talking to folks with different points of view and whether, what kinds of concepts are most resonating to people. And fairness came up as being associated with far more on, say, the liberal side of the equation, rather than, say, among conservatives. And so one of the framing suggestions that came out of this one article I was reading recently was to look at what are the frames that the people on the conservative side of the equation already have. And one of those might be, for example, support for military. And when it comes to physical activity and military, there are quite a lot of topics to talk about, including that some 25% of the people who show up for basic training wouldn't be able to pass it because of their physical fitness levels. But there's also some of the cultural issues that you brought up in your presentation. For example, pointing out military fairness for the people who have served in our military but don't have the same types of access to their spouses and partners. That would be the don't ask, don't tell type policies, or the same kinds of equal treatment for people of color. I'm just wondering if you have any thoughts or comments to follow up on that idea about the framing of these types of issues, whether it's related to health equity issues in general or to physical fitness generally.
I think your comment is an excellent one. And so part of it, and I agree with you that that's probably a pretty liberal view of fairness, but there are other reasons to promote physical activity for health and well-being, which when we look at the economy and what health insurance provides and what the American public has to provide in terms of supporting negative health outcomes as a result of physical inactivity. So physical activity saves money. It helps with economic development, and so when communities see the opportunity to drive foot traffic towards their businesses where they can spend money, that's another reason to promote physical activity within a community. I was talking to you, Pam, earlier about our trail system in Indianapolis. The trail systems go through downtown, through the inner city of Indianapolis, out into the outer ring, which tends to be a little bit more affluent, into the suburbs, which tends to be highly affluent. And no one is concerned with crime happening for people traversing from one community to the next. And it hasn't happened. And those trail systems have been there for 15 years. And they're urban trails. So I know for those of you living in rural environments or park-like environments, these are just paved. It's just a paved trail that takes people from their homes and they can actively commute downtown. And people love it. And they didn't skip the inner city because people couldn't pay more to put into the trail. They went right through it, and it provides opportunity for all kinds of people to be active from the suburbs to the city.
Excellent. I do have one more public health example that your comment about going straight through the city does remind me of, and that's interstates. And specifically, I was recently listening to a podcast on containers. It's called Containers, and it's about the containerization of American ports and how that then led to the kind of global economy that we had today. It's a series podcast that came out earlier this year. And it takes place centered around the Port of Oakland. And one thing that happened in Oakland is that the public health department there began to do some data mapping of where people were dying earlier. And they found that the people of color living closest to the interstate, where the trucks were going directly from the port into outlying areas, were the ones that were dying the earliest. And so you found, immediately from the data, the surveillance of the area, they found that the proximity to the highway was one of the biggest factors in people's health. They then went about instituting different measures to limit the amount of pollution that came off of the trucks that went through there, and they started to see some improvement. I'm actually not sure if I remember correctly where that ended up, but it was a nice demonstration of the intersection between public health and the health equity issues that come up over the ways that communities have been historically treated across the country.
It's a good point, and we do hear lots of examples of that, Pam, where the interstates were built during segregation for the most part, and so they were built to further segregate communities. And so that construction at the time was intentional to keep communities of low income and minority groups separate from the more affluent and white groups. And so addressing this issue of physical activity participation and gentrification in the context of that's where the interstates are, that's where the people who were most disenfranchised lived, and now they're getting pushed out. It is important to keep that in mind. That's where they could afford to buy property, and it's really important to preserve those communities. And I had mentioned in my part of my presentation about preserving the community assets and preserving the individuals within the community through smart growth.
So that's one of those lessons, I think, that it takes a long time to learn. I have a question here that I'm not entirely sure I understand, but it has to do with commenting on, industrialization or commercialization of fitness, particularly in the U.S., as a factor for physical activity disparities and inequities among intersecting identity groups. I've actually asked for a little bit more information from the person who asked that, but if that does resonate with you, what that means, then please comment.
Well, if I understand it, it's an example would be the fitness industry, and we talk about this a lot through the American College of Sports Medicine, that the fitness industry is probably one of the very few industries where people have to choose their sex. If you're going to go into a locker room, there's a men's locker room and there's a women's locker room, and you really can't exercise unless you come in dressed or you have to choose your gender identity. I also think part of it is people being able to afford having access to physical activity professionals, and so fitness professionals. And so we, in public health arena, hear about food deserts all the time. We don't hear about exercise deserts. But people who maybe have great places to walk or great places to bike, but if they really need a little bit of extra help for physical activity support, identifying affordable fitness professionals is really difficult. And so we're working on strategies to address those issues, which really more and more are looking like having one fitness professional and several trainees to support people for less money. And we use that model here, and it's worked out really well. We've been doing it for 10 years, a little over 10 years, and it works out really well where our exercise science students work with community members in personal training group fitness instruction. And so the industry can be supported, is supported by people who have those resources, but it does, and I agree, tend to leave out those disparate groups, especially who have low incomes. Most of the fitness centers, just because of laws, are built to be accessible to people with disabilities. But that's also a fairly new thing. And the people from Lakeshore Foundation, who if they remain on the call, can say it's a very new thing to have accessible exercise equipment so that people can work out in a commercial fitness center regardless of their disability. So I think that's what the person was asking about. It is a problem, and we are thinking about and talking about that.
Okay, so we have 3 minutes till the top of the hour, and I have one more. It's a comment that's also a question, and it has to do with diversity in the physical activity workforce, which we talked about earlier. And the person is saying that as a young professional in an urban area seeking professional positions, it seems that often the people who are given the positions to address public health in the minority communities don't necessarily look like the target audience, which is not terribly surprising. But this person's asking that I heard you speak of the Minority Research Mentor Network, but what other resources, opportunities are there for minority professionals to gain positions in the field? And do you have any comments on that?
Yeah, so I don't think it's any different. You have to network, and this is true in any job area or any professional area, that the more people you can meet. So participating in the webinar is really good, so you can learn about who the professionals are in the field, but networking, because people are going to hire who they know. And that's, we talked about, there are groups. I talked about people being most comfortable in homogeneous groups, and that's true. And if you can find within your community somebody who's hiring specifically diverse populations, to understand that diverse groups perform better, but you still have to know them. They're going to hire who they know. And so I think that the networking is really important. Through different professional organizations, we have minority health and research networking groups. So I can suggest that you start with physical activity meetings. Pam, you mentioned the Active Living Research meeting is a great opportunity to network. The Society of Behavioral Medicine has a lot of minority physical activity researchers, as does the American College of Sports Medicine. And I'm sure there are others. Those are just what I belong to. But starting to network and meet those professionals who are in positions to hire, or who can introduce you to people who are in positions to hire.
All right, and that's going to have to be our last answer for today. NiCole Keith, I want to thank you for your time and for your presentation today. And for everyone else, thanks for tuning in. This concludes our webinar for this Juneteenth of 2017 for the National Physical Activity Society. Thank you for listening.
Thanks, Pam.